July, we're launching a new series called Experio Reflections. And this is a way for us practitioners, people doing design in order to develop and transform our public systems, to reflect on our practices and to invite people doing similar things to join in the dialogue, to have a joint conversation about what it means to be designing in the public sector. So this is not research. It's not like a forum to present facts or truths. This is rather a way for us to try to articulate and reflect on what we encounter in our work and to hope other people will join in that reflection. So we're really happy to see so many of you here today, and we're hoping that that you will join in this prototype, we would say, of our very first Experio Reflections. And this will most likely develop over time and maybe become something different depending on how it works out. And our plan is to publish around 3 reflections pieces a year. And not only us in Experio Lab can publish, so we're inviting everyone who wants to publish in this series. And it could be a text, it could be a film, it could be a structured dialogue, and it doesn't have to be in English. And it doesn't have to have this quite big scope that we have today, which is a bit theoretical about these paradigms. It could be very practical about design, it could be very local. So anyone who's interested are invited to get in touch with us, and we can talk about ideas for what you would like to publish. And Karin is going to put the email, my colleague, in the chat where you can get in touch if you're interested in publishing something in this series. So for this first reflections, this piece that we've written today, we took a bit of a broader view on how design practice in the public sector. And we've asked ourselves, why are we developing our practice the way we are? And what influences and shapes our work? And what directions do we see as essential for the future of designing public systems? And this really started off as a conversation with us and Joe Harrington, who is a colleague and an advisor to us with a long international experience of using design. And together with Joe, we've sort of explored the landscape we're working in. And what are these big paradigms that have shaped our public systems, and how does that affect us when we're designing? And we felt that the way that the welfare sector is organized and managed sometimes creates problems and even obstacles in our work, but it has also challenged us to discover new ways of working and new ways of using design. So this particular text today has quite a big scope on how our public systems has evolved and how design has adapted in response, but it also highlights the way that our practice in Experio Lab has developed over time, often in partnership and together with many of you who are here today. So today, Joe will, together with my Experio Lab colleague Matilda Legeby, who has a long experience of using design and system design, they will talk a bit about this paper that you've been sent, and that also is published on our website if you want to look at it there or spread it to someone else. So after Matilda and Joseph's quite short presentation, our friend Sune Knudsen from Denmark, who is a co-founder of the Transition Collective in Denmark, he will reflect a bit on what we've written and share a bit of his thoughts and ideas from his perspective. So, and after Sune's reflection, we will have an open discussion where all of you are very welcome to join in. So really hoping that this will be an interactive seminar when we discuss things together. So if you want to say something, and you can raise your hand or you can write something in the chat. It could be a question, it could be a reflection, and my colleague Karin will help us to make sure that we mix that in. And you're happy to ask questions throughout the whole seminar. And so we have some people here who don't speak Swedish, but in the discussion you're free to ask your question or say your reflection in Swedish or in English, and we'll try to translate. So if you're more comfortable speaking Swedish, please do. And we're recording now, and we're going to record Matilda and Joe's presentation and Sune's reflection, but when our discussion starts, we'll stop recording. And we'll put the presentations on the website next to the written piece. I'm wondering if anyone has any questions so far, or Matilda and Karin and Joe, have I forgot anything? No? Then I'll hand over to Joe and Matilda to tell us a bit about this piece that we've written.
Yeah, thank you, Kaisa. And as Kaisa said, we worked with Joe as our advisor. And believe it or not, but we have often ended up discussing the development of design in development of public sector. Both what makes it relevant, but also what makes it so incredibly hard. And we're also curious on the new things. And recently we felt the need to position us in our work with design in relation to public sector work with missions. And we could say that the work we do with the nära vård or close care is sort of a mission, if you want a brief example. But with this paper, we want to share our topics of discussions and rough thoughts on why Experio Labs are where we are now and why we're doing this design processes that we are, together with the Swedish government and youth from Säffle in the same room. How did we end up here? And it would have been completely impossible to end up here without the valuable work of Experio Lab Network, which is also part of this and this presentation and the development of Experio Lab. And I can see that a few are here today. That's really nice. But Joe, please take us through this paper.
Okay, hi everybody. So I'm going to start by just giving a little bit of a description of these paradigms and how they're shaping the way that we think about our public services and public leadership, and then the way in which design has been shaped by those paradigms too. By paradigm, we mean a sort of worldview, a kind of logic, a way of thinking about public services and public leadership and how they're developed, and how that sort of begins to shape particular responses and methodologies. So we're going to tell a story of three paradigms and their relationship to one another. As Kaisa really importantly kind of underlined, this isn't about telling a particular fact or truth about anything. This is a perspective, one that we've found useful in our conversations to help think about this question of the role of design and the way that we can best support this development within these paradigms. So to do this, I'm going to channel some, what was it called, Kaisa and Matilda, the Swedish education program?
Utbildningsradion.
Thank you. It's great. So we're going to do a little, just to help us go through this, I'm going to switch to my overhead camera here, and we're going to tell a little bit of this story and draw out some of this thinking. So where are we going to start? It has a long history from our Enlightenment period in development through ideas of kind of classification, which of course Sweden played a significant part with Linnaeus and others, and really importantly in relationship to industrialization. So this first paradigm that we shared in the paper is one that really reached its height and its dominance in the last 100 years or so. And still, for many of us in public services, it is an incredibly dominant and potent paradigm in the way that we think about both public services and how they're organized and how we can best improve and develop them. So I'm going to tell a little bit about what that paradigm is. So we might start by thinking about, we started with this blobby space of a particular issue or challenge that public services might be responding to. So for example, let's call this health, this kind of blobby shape that health exists in our public services. And this idea from industrialization and enlightenment came through that the best way that we need to think about issues like health is what we need to do is we need to break them down into their smallest possible components, smallest possible aspects, in order to be able to develop them, understand their performance, understand how we can measure and assess that performance, and really to perfect public services. So in our health services, this is exactly what we saw. We saw this, what we could describe as an atomization, a breaking down into literally the smallest parts possible in order to really understand every particular element of health and support that we need to give people. So what we saw here is this emergence of what's become known really in the last 30 or 40 years of new public management. because it comes out of this idea that if we can separate things down, if we can understand each of these as specialist elements within any particular service that we have or any particular system that we have, then we can measure them, we can assess their performance, we can make sure that people are accountable for the results that they need to deliver, and that will enable us to perfect public services. It will enable us to perfect issues and challenges around things like health. And if we zoomed in to one of these little specializations and squares, and we kind of took a closer look at that, what we see is this logic from industrialization, which is very linear, this idea of kind of Taylorist or Fordist ideas of the production line, where we're trying to understand often very kind of linear processes of development. We're trying to understand a kind of causal relationship between the issue. And then when we can understand that, we can measure and assess each element of that. And again, this idea of kind of performance measurement and evaluation become the kind of key doctrine then of how we work and support the development of public services. And we can see how design began to play a really important role in these processes. Design, being born out of the same industrial processes, we're able to think about how we could use design to improve the efficiency and effectiveness of these kinds of processes, how we can support the engagement of people in each of these. We can communicate effectively what people need to do. We can think about, importantly, their experience going through this kind of service. Now, as that started to emerge and this idea of design being applied into this new public management paradigm, we saw something begin to disrupt that paradigm. And what that was we started to recognize the need within this wonderfully organized, nice and linear boxes and specializations of public services. We started to recognize that when people interacted with these public services, things became a little bit more difficult to organize around, because people, unlike this nice kind of Fordist, Taylorist idea of the production line, their experiences and their challenges are often very not as linear and not as easy to understand. So when we kind of zoom into that person, we see again something where all their problems look like this, and they're interacting with one another, and it becomes very complex for us to be able to work and understand around. So fitting people into these nice little simple boxes isn't necessarily the easiest or best response to be able to actually meet these very complex challenges that people have. So what we started to see here was a different kind of paradigm emerging, one that suggested that these little boxes of specialism, they'd become silos, they'd become things that were really kind of confining and limiting the support that we could give to people, and they were really restricting our capacity to organize around those complex needs of people and individuals. So we saw this emergence of this other paradigm, and this is really kind of prevalent in the last 30 years or so, where we saw the emergence of this idea around a more joined up or integrated form of public service, where what we wanted to start to do was to connect these different dots together, to connect all these different specialist areas together, really importantly, around the needs of our users, around the needs of people. And we saw a shift within public services and public service leadership and management towards this idea of driving big integration programs that could make sure that we're integrating around people's needs. And similarly, we saw a shift then of the way in which design was being employed, because design, rather than focusing on improving the effectiveness and efficiencies of some of these particular elements or touch points of a service, we saw design being increasingly employed to helping these different parts of the system, these different elements, come together to find shared outcomes, to find shared visions of how they want to operate, to understand and deepen their understanding of their users' needs and what's common across their services that they need to organize around, and then to begin to collaborate together in order to create more integrated, joined up services around users' needs. And we saw this grow from just being applied to particular fields like health to then also linking to some of our other fields. So, for example, we started to see in mental health the link between particular kind of medical services of mental health needing to connect with housing services, needing to connect out to drugs and alcohol or employment services. So moving beyond some of the boundaries of a health service and into an employment service, into other areas, other parts of our public system. So this approach to a more kind of joined up way of working has been, again, really prevalent in the last 30 years. And for many of us, we can still sort of feel the significance of this paradigm. It's really shaping the way that we think about public services and the challenges that they represent. And it kind of works with this logic that the idea that if we can really align, if we can really coordinate and connect our public services around our users' or patients' needs, then we can really improve and develop better outcomes. However, what we've seen really in the last 10 or 15 years or so is the limitations of just a joined up approach. Because what became very clear was this really kind of joined up approach, although it could help us to improve and develop outcomes around those individuals' needs, we started to see how we're still very kind of locked in or entrenched to these ways of organizing. And all of these different elements of our system, we started to see how bounded they were and how difficult it was to work beyond their particular boundaries or work beyond their particular silos. So we started to see something that we felt quite perhaps trapped by. And this is where the sort of third paradigm that we're speaking to really came into force. Because in the last 10 or 15 years, this recognition that perhaps joined up isn't going to be enough to respond to the kinds of complex challenges that we face today, we need to think about how we break free of this arrangement and create ways in which we can reorganize public services around bigger societal goals and bigger societal challenges. And this is where this idea of missions came from. So Mariam Mazzucati really drew a lot of inspiration in capturing this idea of missions in relationship to public leadership from things like the moon landing and the Apollo moon missions of the 1960s, where very similarly, America found itself in a position where it wasn't going to win the space race, and it needed to kind of galvanize and reorganize all of the kind of separate elements of its industrial processes around building a spacecraft able to go to the moon, and needed to kind of focus them on some shared agenda that would really move them towards this big shared mission. So they created this moon mission. Kennedy described this idea of getting to the moon as something that was going to happen in the next 5 years, set out this big, often top-down mission that they needed to focus on. And we're seeing these kinds of missions now emerging within our public services, setting these big common challenges and common goals that work beyond those boundaries and arrangements of current systems as they are now. And the idea is that that will galvanize and mobilize a kind of entrepreneurial spirit to break free from these particular silos and arrangements and collectively move towards this big new mission that will help us to transform our public services and radically and significantly improve their outcomes. So this is the three paradigms that we're seeing seem to be really significant within the way that we're looking at and understanding our public services at the moment and their impact on design. Because we now see within the kind of missions orientation, we see design being increasingly used and increasingly applied to the design of mission, the development of these trajectories and processes needed to get to those kinds of new missions. Now, the challenge is that this is a limited view still. There are still some challenges of how we move from this current arrangement and paradigms that we're in now towards this new paradigm and this new arrangement, and how we break free and move away towards these bigger societal missions and societal visions. Because what we see is, and something that we've been paying a lot of attention to in Experio Lab and Samhällsnytta, is this space here, this gap between the current state of things, which we could call A, the current arrangement, and this kind of new arrangement that we want to create, B, over here. And this transitional space, this transitional move between one way of the system is organized, state A to state B, is a really difficult thing for us to operate through and work through. And so increasingly, we've been thinking about how do we support these processes of change to happen? How do we support that transition from A to B? So this is one of our kind of ways of thinking about responding to that. So currently we do have this idea in the missions orientation that we're currently in state A, and we're going to create a vision for, a mission for over here, a new state, a new different kind of vision for our systems, and we're going to move from A to B. But what we find in our work is, again, that move from A to B, that transition isn't as easy as it might look. And what we need to do is think about the spaces and the processes that we need to create to bridge that shift between A and B, and recognize that actually our vision of B is very locked in by our current perspective of what A is. And actually, we need to deepen our understanding of A if we're even beginning to understand what the mission and the vision should be of B. So thinking about that space of transition has been a really important way that we've been thinking about the evolving role of design. And in our work in Sample Splitter particularly, and in work within Experio Lab, what we've been thinking about is how do you create these arenas, these spaces that enable us to hold and develop that space of transition between A and B. And there are some key characteristics that we've been working on in order to understand how we can work with that particular transition and that particular focus. So one is that we need to understand the future. We need to have those visions of the future that our missions orientation demand of us. They're really important to kind of galvanize and focus our work and attention. And so increasingly, we've been using kind of speculative processes from speculative design and others to build those visions, to understand that different kind of future. But we also need to understand in relationship to that the current context, the current challenges and the current problems. And we need to see the system from many different types of perspectives in order to be able to understand what a different future would be and understand what it's going to take to transition between that future. So in our work within arenas, what we often do is try and bring together lots of different perspectives of the system to try and understand the system differently and create opportunities to come together to imagine what a different kind of future might be. Now, in lots of these missions orientated processes, what we see is this very kind of top-down approach to that, where we set the missions from up on high, and then we deliver the missions within the context that we work within. Now, the top down is very important, but what we've recognized in a lot of the work that we've been doing is the importance of place, the importance of the particular context and places of the places that are going to go through these kinds of transitions, and how we connect them and engage them in the process of understanding the nature of the problem and understanding the new kind of vision for the future and the new mission that we might want. So really deepening the relationships into places, into our regions, into our municipalities. So there's real ownership of this process going forward. And then what we see is the role of policy needing to change, that we need different kinds of enabling policy that support this process and hold this process going forward. And so we've been increasingly designing and developing policies within our work in order to be able to respond to that challenge. So here we see this kind of description of the need to work differently with this shift between A and B, and create these arenas and contexts to support a more emergent process of change over time in order to be able to respond to these paradigms that are still very much part of the way that we work within our public services, but to create this context to enable this transition, but from this current arrangement of how things are operating towards a more missions orientated way of operating. So I'll pause there with that picture and then hand over to Matilda to bring that to life with some more examples.
Thank you, Joe. This is amazing. And welcome to sort of behind the scenes on one of our meetings. Usually he draws on whiteboards in the room, but this is amazing. But so we have tried to connect these paradigms to the evolution of Experio Lab and then eventually Samhällsnytta. And I will do this really, really short. So, but the Experio Lab started sort of when the new public management paradigm was in the public sector. And in this, when this mindset is present, it's hard to even hold a user-centric perspective sometimes. And I think that's something that many of us have struggled with. And there's Experio Lab started doing design and has continued to do design all around Sweden within the public sphere, to move out of those new public management squares and to see the user's complex every day. And one example of work is from SÖS Innovation, where they're using service design method to enhance the sense of security and well-being among patients and their relatives visiting Södersjukhuset when they're in the emergency. And that is improving their overall experience during their stay because of a higher sense of security. And in the second then paradigm, in the joined up, there seems to be an understanding of the need for collaboration over organizational borders, but that doesn't make that easy either. So we have, through the systemic design approach with Experio Lab and Samhällsnytta then, been developing through collaboration with 7 different governmental inquiries. So from elderly care to individual with substance use disorder. And these are all complex needs, which needs a lot of actors. And one particular example is Samsjuklighetsutredningen, the comorbidity inquiry, aiming at improving services for individuals with both mental health and addiction issues. And here we have constructed a co-creative policy design process where different actors in the systems, patients and families, health and social care professionals, and managers at local, regional, and national level participate. And this work also needs to continue and be worked with at all levels. But then when we come to this latest paradigm and the transformative work, as we're trying to do now, we have the Experio Lab network, as said, that is embedded within design capacity, and they played a key role in developing and shaping this structure. And this wouldn't have been possible, as said. And as I said before, we can call the mission of nära vård or close care, where this task is coming from an idea from the Swedish government to transform the Swedish care to become closer, which is a really big task. So that is one thing that we're working with. So we've tried to do this by establishing multiple arenas and to do work with this transformation. And one particular arena that I'm going to just briefly touch upon as well is when we did work with the National Delegation for Agenda 2030 and the project Nu börjar med barnen, eller Now we start with the children. And this arena was a platform for dialogue for policy development focused on building a proactive and promotive system for well-being of children and young people. And one important goal was to explore how children and young people's well-being could be strengthened and through proactive and preventative measures. And we engaged in this project as a whole, approximately 330 children through the municipalities. And we had 4 regions, 5 governmental agencies, 5 national organizations, and researchers from 3 universities. This was a really big project. And within this local pilot, we did a range of experiments, exploring what this system could be. In Ljusnarsberg, for example, the whole society were coming together around children and youth, possibility to create a space for themselves where youth was supported to create activities. And this is a rural mining society, and they are now together renovating an old house in the center of the society. And the special thing here is that the civil society is doing this together with the municipality. So it is the whole society coming together. And in Säffle in Värmland, they are experimenting with the processes for leadership together with children and youth participation. So that is actually affecting the local politics. And the learnings from this project also became a report to the National Coordinator for Agenda 2030, to the Swedish government. So there you have the policy. In recommendation, what we need to do to make this development grow in the different places that we are in. And yeah, as you see in this picture, we are working with this sort of method. So we started with a vision, actually. How can we create the promotive system for all children and youth well-being? And we had a few collective workshops where we tried to get that common goal together. on the different levels, from the children and youth, what they think is important, and also to the national policy. And then we also need to explore the now, like what is the current situation like, what needs to shift in relation to this goal. Yes, the diverse perspectives. Also from all the involved, but maybe with a more special focus also on the local areas. And also then the place and the history, what is, it is both reflecting how we got here today, but also what is easier or harder to change. What is this place made of? What are the sort of the norms that will be really hard to to shift, and what could be easier to manage? What is already happening in this place? What are their drives? What are the possibilities to go for? So that is also, and then the policy enablers, what can support this change to actually happen in this area. So we're trying to do this, and we're calling it sort of emergent practices. And we are relating it to missions in some sort, but also questioning how do we do this in relations to the other development in the public sector.
Great. Thank you, Matilda and Joe. I was thinking before we bring Sune in to reflect on this, does anyone in the audience have a question or comment or anything you want to say so far? If not, we'll invite Sune in. And as you said, you're the co-founder of the Transition Collective in Denmark, but maybe you should just please briefly say something about your background. We're really happy to have you here and reflect on this work. How you see it from the Danish perspective and your experiences?
Thank you so much, Kajsa, and thank you, Joe and Matilda. That was wonderful. I loved the drawing, and I also loved the drawing on the case experience. So that was really informative, also for me. So just briefly about my background, because that also sort of says something about where my friendly, maybe even loving criticism will come from. So I was, before joining the Transition Collective, I was the COO of the Danish Design Center for close to 9 years, where we worked a lot with systems design, with transforming design practices, showing the way for design in Denmark and internationally, moving to a systemic space. And we ended up defining missions as our way of working and being in the world at the Danish Design Center. Before that, I worked as a management consultant, and then I was a part of several government innovation initiatives. So I was a part of what was called Mind Lab, which was essentially, I think, the world's first government innovation lab. I didn't join it from the beginning, but I joined it in 2007, which was in the sort of second iteration where it turned towards a human-centric design lab within government. I am not, though, a designer. I am a political scientist, and historian, an infantry officer. So my background is different, but I've been working alongside designers and with design and trying to create frameworks for design to create public value for the past 17 years. So that's where I'm coming from. So I deeply believe in the sort of in the constant promise of design, even though it hasn't been fulfilled quite yet. We continue to see beautiful glimpses of it, I think, and I think I'll elaborate a little bit on that. So thank you for this wonderful presentation, and thank you for the paper. I'll start with the friendly and then get to the critical, which will also be friendly, right? But I love the format. I love that you did this. I love that it came from discussions, from passionate practitioners and theoretics. So I really like the format. Of course, I would want more, but I guess that's what people in this call are going to elaborate, hopefully, on this. I also love the premise of looking at the development of these public sector paradigms. You might even say societal paradigms in many ways, and that's might be a slight objection that it cannot be fenced in to be public sector paradigms. It might be welfare development paradigms. It might be societal paradigms even. And I love the notion of trying to look at the correlations, if not the causality, between the development of design in the public sector and the welfare space and the development of the space and its paradigms itself. And then just I want to say I love the notions of arenas. Please, please, please use this concept because it situates space, something that designers are really good at in a systemic world, if you will. So I really like the notion of arenas. So there's a lot of good, and so all the things I'll be saying now comes from just an appreciation of this work. I think I have 8 points, and I think I should shift through them quite quickly, and hopefully we can continue discussing it after I present it and other gatherings as well. My first, well, they're not so much criticisms as just reflections or questions that build on what you have been writing. One is, I think it's interesting to visit or revisit the notion of correlation and causality. So I'm just wondering whether design has just been a function, a dependent variable of the developments in the public sector space. So design was placed in the public sector and was seen to start to create value some 25, 30 years ago. And has it just kind of been following the developments in the public sector? Or has design also had an influence on it? And this discussion, and it's an open question, I think, but there may be a dialectic that we're not quite aware of. Design tends to take like this little brother or little sister perspective, like we're just here visiting, trying to do some good. But maybe design also did something to push some development. So one reflection might be, so in the design field, the broader design field, there's a massive reflection on the influence of human-centric design, which was kind of defined as something inherently good. But we also now know that human-centered design has turbocharged some not so fantastic developments in terms of consumerism, in terms of hyper-individualism. So is there a dialectic there that's worth visiting? And I recognize that design doesn't have the same place in the public sector that it does in the private sector. But I'm just wondering if it's just paradigms of the public sector and then design as a function. So design kind of follows what happens in the public sector. So that's one notion or one question that I think you're not wrong in saying what you're saying. It's just an object of further exploration, I guess. So causality and correlation. Then there's this, as we enter into the discussion about missions, and I really liked your elaboration, Joe, about the transitioning and the role of design, how that might be developed. But you kind of state that there is this risk of missions work being sort of captive to top-down processes. And I'm just thinking, is that new? I came into the public sector in Denmark when we were sort of starting to scratch the user-centric, the anthropological phase, the design research phase. And we were struggling with top-down logics. So the service design phase, the systems phase, and now the emergent phase. I think top-down has always been there. Obviously, it's something different, but the basic logic, I think, is not new. So the question is, what do you think is new here? I think that's something to quote unquote double click on and explore further. I think it's always been the premise of design that it enters into a top-down world with some bottom-up perspectives. So I think there's something there. And the reason why I say this also, maybe there are some learnings from the other stages of design and paradigms that we might bring into this to say, how might we better function together with the top-down logic? Missions aren't inherently, and you also write that, aren't inherently top-down, but they're placed in a system which is top-down. So they might be taken, they might be put into this logic and just used as another way of sort of implementing strategic logics top-down. But it doesn't have to be that. And maybe there are some learnings from previous experiences. Sorry. It seems to me that there's sort of this tone of, as we turn to missions, that might automatically lead to design having a new place in the world. I'm not so sure. It opens a world of opportunities for design to do the good that it, I guess most everyone in this Teams call will agree it can do, but it's not a given, right? So I think there's a lot of space to be explored as to what needs to be true for design to actually play the role in missions that we're also curious about, right? And there's this, and it's also because of the brevity of the note, which I think is good, but there's something to be explored. And the reason why I say this also, I've been in this field. So this is not a theoretical point as much as it's just a point of having worked in this field of practice for so many years. There's this notion that design is inherently good, and we're just kind of waiting for people to discover it or rediscover it, and then everything will be good. I think there needs to be some serious, not fighting, but some grunt work done here in order to place design here. So missions and the notion of working with these various complex areas that missions are meant to address obviously opens for arenas, to use that phrase, but what needs to be true for design to enter into those arenas? It's not going to happen automatically, I think. And obviously at Experio Lab, you've been doing something to lead the way, right? But how do we sort of expand that to all the other places where missions are worked on, right? Then I think actually, Joe, you answered one of the reflections I had reading the paper, which was more concretely, what should design do in the macro space? Because it's not that design hasn't been present in macro discussions before. It's been, I mean, I myself have facilitated a lot of workshops with politicians, national, international, and local as well. But this is something different altogether. As you're working on joining up the micro, the meso, and the macro, something new is going on. And so what are the practices? What are the design methods that should be applied in the macro space? It's not enough to just bring user knowledge into the space, which was very much the claim to fame for design 10, 15 years ago, right? So what are the methods? And you described it beautifully with the four elements. I was thinking that there's some futuring, there's some speculative design, there's some value creating systems or ecosystem design, some of these disciplines within design. And that leads me to the next reflection, which is, do we have the skills in society? And we're talking about Sweden, Denmark here, the UK, some of the most sort of design mature countries in the world. But do we actually have the skills within the design fields to do this work? Some do, but are there enough? Are designers being trained in the design schools and universities in the right way? Or do we simply have sort of a lack of skills? And that leads me to another question: is it only from classical design that we should look for the skills that are needed for this? So in essence, I'm led back to that quote on what are the boundaries of design? Well, let's talk about the boundaries of the problem. So you talked about diversity, Joe. I think maybe we should look at a much more diverse notion of design skills, because otherwise I think we run the risk of opening the door and then running out of design capacity. I hope that makes sense. Then I think there's a huge question around whether designers, broadly understood, are equipped to enter into these more political fields that open up when we talk about missions. Because missions are, I would say, inherently political. Maya Mazzucato says that innovation is political, and missions are kind of innovations on steroids, right? So it's a lot of innovations bundled together to solve big problems. The question is, are designers and this design equipped for the more political field? Now, in my experience, designers have been guests in discussions where there have been political actors, and then designers leave again when decisions have to be made. So my role as a political scientist working along designers has very often been to translate design into a space of politics. And I don't know if designers and design as a whole are ready to enter this space, because design can be normative, and often the norms of design are attractive, appealing, something that we can all agree is good. But it can also be a little bit naive. Sometimes naivety is also good. It's the little boy from The Emperor's New Clothes. The question of candidness, of naivety, that kind of opens up a room. But sometimes when things get political, they get a little bit, not just messy, because designers love the mess, right? It's embracing the mess, but it gets a little bit dirty as well. And I've just from personal experience seen a lot of designers get uncomfortable in that space. So mess is one thing, and designers master that. But dirty, which is, I mean, some of the things that we have to tackle these years, right? These weeks, they're not just messy, they are a little bit dirty. So how does design function in that field? And if we're talking about the missions that aren't just the technical ones, but that are the really sort of the wicked ones, how do designers navigate? Do they stay in the space, or do they just open people's eyes and then leave and hope that people make the right choices? And then I also think, following from that, there's still this legacy of design which is human-centric. Design's contribution to a policy field or a system is often to bring the perspective of the humans or the individual human. And it's a legacy that's helped a lot of work on the joined up services, of course, because you could take sort of the individual and see how the system doesn't function joined up towards the individual human being. Healthcare systems, waste management systems, social systems, a lot of other systems, employment as well. But as we're talking about sort of wicked problems, systemic problems, we're also shifting our focus to systems and not individuals. And I'm just wondering if design is ready to take that leap, because sometimes that means that it's putting the system over the individual. And there's going to have to be a change, I think, in the norms of a lot of the design field. And this is not to say that the individual perspective isn't still important. How do individual humans perceive a system? What do they need to act within the system? But we also need to be able to look at systems as an object of design as well, or subject of design, sorry. And then finally, I think I was just coming from Transition Collective. I was just very happy that you talked about the transitional space. And I think there's just one thing that we need to be mindful of. And again, it is not so much a critique of the paper as it is maybe building on it. The design has a preference for the beginning of something. There's a reason why we call something the design phase, and then something ensues. But if we're not just talking about emergent practices, but practices of emergence, which is to say that we're designing from A towards B, but we don't really know what B is, which is kind of the hallmark of dealing with a wicked problem. We don't know what the solution is. We'll have to discover it as best we can. So not just emergent practices, but practices of emergence. That means that designers have to stay in the muck for a much longer time. And what needs to be true for designers to do that? How can design be relevant for a longer period of time? So I guess I'm not so much critiquing the paper as I'm saying it just led me to a number of different reflections. And that's because basically, I think it's a really great paper and I agree with much of it. But these are some of the things that I would like to just dive deeper into. I hope it makes sense.
Yeah, great, Sune. That was very, I think you've taken the reflections we did to a new level and posed some really interesting questions.